Hey, y'all. Welcome to the Testing Psychologist podcast, episode number 20. I'm Dr. Jeremy Sharp. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Testing Psychologist podcast. Hope y'all are all doing really well. I am doing another pre-roll this week because we have a little bit of a special episode this time. Here in just a minute, I am going to play you the audio from an interview that I did on the Insurance Answers podcast. So the Insurance Answers podcast, if you haven't heard of it, is a podcast aimed at mental health clinicians who want to learn more about how to bill insurance in their practices. Now, I got to know the hosts, Danielle and Katia, through Facebook, which seems like the place that I meet everybody these days, but with good reason. I made some great contacts, and Danielle reached out to me and asked if I would be a guest to talk specifically about insurance billing for psychological testing. And yeah, I was happy to do that, and I think the interview turned out really well. They asked some great questions. We really break down a lot of the kind of small nitty-gritty questions about how to bill insurance for testing. And my hope is that you will walk away with the idea that it is totally doable if you want to do it. And that has definitely been my experience. And in the meantime, I hope you get a nice introduction to Danielle and Katia and their podcast, and maybe follow up and listen to a few more of their episodes because they're great. So without further ado, here I am on a reverse interview with the Insurance Answers podcast.
This is episode 19, Insurance Billing for Psychologists, with guest interview Dr. Jeremy Sharp.
Our guest today, Dr. Jeremy Sharp, he is a licensed clinical psychologist. He's a clinical director at the Colorado Center for Assessment and Counseling, a private practice that he founded in 2009. It has grown to include 5 other clinicians. He earned his undergraduate degree in experimental psychology from University of South Carolina before getting his master's and PhD in counseling psychology from Colorado State University. Jeremy specializes in psychological and neuropsychological evaluation with kids and adolescents. He is also the host of the Testing Psychologist podcast, so everyone will have to check that out as well. This podcast, he provides private practice consultation for psychologists and other mental health professionals who want to start or grow a testing services for their practice. Jeremy lives in Fort Collins, Colorado with his wife, who is also a therapist, and his 2 young kids. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah.
Welcome. So Jeremy, tell us a little bit about your role as a licensed psychologist and what types of services you offer with your clients.
Yeah. So let's see. I kind of think of my practice really in 2 phases. You know, what I think of now as like my former life as a psychologist. I had a generalist practice specialized in couples. So I had a lot of training in emotionally focused therapy for couples. And a couple years after I founded my practice, things really started to shift. And that's when I started to focus primarily on just doing testing and evaluation. So I'd say over the last, 6 years, something like that, I've really only done testing primarily with kids and adolescents. So that's what my world looks like these days personally. So I do, like I said, psych testing and neuropsych testing for kids, a lot of IQ, academic, memory learning, executive functioning, that kind of stuff, personality assessment. And here in our clinic, we offer a variety of services. So we have a few other therapists who do therapy with kids and with adults, and we also do assessment with adults as well.
Okay. All right. When people come for psychological testing, what are their main concerns?
Yeah. So for me, with seeing kids primarily, I get a lot of referrals from pediatricians and from schools and just other parents around town. So I'd say the big 3 referral questions for us, or for me right now, are probably, does my kid have ADHD? Does he have a learning disorder? Or do they have autism? Those are probably the top concerns.
Okay.
And then there's usually, let's say, some mood stuff wrapped up in there as well. So trying to separate out like how much of this might be anxiety or depression or even more serious, bipolar, psychotic stuff as well. Differential diagnosis of most of those things.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what testing looks like when accepting insurance?
Oh, goodness. Yes. Testing and accepting insurance. Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of joking. Like everybody, there's something about testing and insurance, and it's supposed to be a hard thing. But, it's actually not that tough. And I assume we'll get into some of this stuff as we go along. But insurance has been pretty easy to deal with in the testing world. So, there are a few particular insurance companies that are really strict about pre-authorization and might limit the number of hours. But for the most part, as long as you have your documentation in place for medical necessity of testing, most insurance companies are fairly easy to deal with.
That is really helpful to hear.
Yeah, that's really good to hear, because I've always assumed that it was a huge mess as far as getting testing with insurance. So that's great to hear that it's not that difficult.
Yeah, I think there was, I don't know what you call it, kind of a holdover from years past. I think it used to be a lot harder. And I think it is actually a lot tougher, like maybe in a hospital setting.
Oh, sure.
But private practice has been okay. And, they shifted some of the guidelines for reimbursement for testing. I forget when it was, maybe like 2006 or 2008. And that made it a lot easier to get insurance coverage for testing. So I think that's made a big difference.
Interesting. Okay. Have you always accepted insurance in your practice?
I have. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, totally. So when I started my private practice, I didn't even think about not taking insurance. I mean, this was...
Right on.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm sure y'all are big fans of that. So, like I said, I never even considered not doing it. I feel like I didn't know back then, to be honest, that I could not take insurance. I just thought that's what you did. So I did, and it has worked out well. And over the years, I mean, we've gotten busier and busier, and I think have a decent reputation here around town. So I think we could go off insurance, but every time that I revisit it, I keep coming back to how important it is for access for certain clients, and really for most clients. I mean, because testing is expensive without insurance, and I feel like it's really important to provide those services for folks, through the insurance process.
That's great.
So when you first started accepting insurance, what was the credentialing process like for you?
Yeah, gosh, I feel like I blocked it out.
Yeah,
it's easy to
do.
It
actually, I don't think it was too bad. I mean, people. So I think, and maybe y'all could speak to this, but our community has gotten more and more, let's say, saturated over the years, and so I keep referring back to like the good old days when I started, which is really not that long ago, but it felt like it back then. That I don't know that there was a whole lot of competition to get on insurance panels. So it went fairly quickly, like 2 or 3 months,
that's very quickly.
Fast, yeah.
I applied to probably 4 or 5 panels, like the major ones in our area right off the bat. And I haven't added any insurance panels really since the beginning. So
that's helpful. So then how is billing done for your practice?
Yeah, we have kind of a combination. Let's see, maybe 2 years ago, I brought somebody on, or actually, I contract out the insurance verification. So we have a full-time admin person who does all the scheduling and accounting part and sending out bills. But I also have a separate insurance verification team. So we just relay the client benefit information to that team, and then they run it through their system, whatever magic thing that is, and then they get it back to us like really quick. So
do they also cover authorizations then for you guys?
No,
you'd have that in-house then.
Yeah, we do it all in-house. Either I do it because it requires specific clinical information, or for some of them, my admin person can do that. It's more general.
And so then your admin person is the one that does the billing for your practice then?
Yeah, he does all the accounting and keeps track of patient bills and sends them out and collects
payments. Okay.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
So what are the main differences between billing for counseling or therapy versus testing and assessments?
I think the main thing is just probably the hours involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it totally depends on what kind of assessment you're doing. But, for us, where we do pretty comprehensive evals, we're billing 8, 10, 12 hours of testing per client. And so I think that's the thing is like with counseling, you probably have like 2 codes you might build, like the 90791.
Right. And 1 unit. Yeah.
Therapy code. Yeah. And 1 unit. But for us, so you got the interview code and then you have the testing code, and that can be different depending on what kind of testing it is. And then, some insurance companies prefer you then bill a therapy code for your feedback session. So that kind of, gets a little more complicated. So,
interesting.
And the documentation. So you have to keep track of the hours that you spent on each test and how much time you spend writing reports. And all of that goes into the, the testing note that is submitted for the insurance reimbursement.
Wow. So that's very different than the way the counseling piece works then with all of those codes.
Wow. Yeah.
The number of hours that you kind of have to put in.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's taken a while.
Yeah.
To get it all lined up.
Okay.
What was that? How do I keep track of it all?
Yeah. How do you keep track of it all?
Well, so that's where my EHR system is so helpful. I use therapy notes. I picked it initially because it was really well set up for testing in particular. So the template that they have for a psych testing note or a neuropsych testing note is really detailed. It forces you to specify all the tests that you administer and how much time you spend on them and how much time you spend writing the report. And it totals all the time for you and, puts it all right there. So I like that structure, and that just helps immensely.
Wow. Okay. So can you tell us about authorizations for psychological testing? Is that required or is it dependent on the insurance company?
Yeah, totally dependent on insurance. Well, and I should back up too. There is also some difference between whether you're billing for psych testing or neuropsych testing.
Okay.
And it depends on the insurance company. And of course, this is kind of the joke with insurance. Like you can't nail it down. So of course it's not consistent between companies or,
that would be too easy.
Yeah.
Of course. Like some insurance companies require pre-auth for psych testing, but not neuropsych testing. And then some, vice versa.
Okay. So can you explain a little bit the difference between what the neuropsych testing looks like versus the psychological testing?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a hard question. I think
I just threw you a curveball. Sorry.
So depending who you ask, this answer probably will differ. But generally speaking, when you're trying to decide if it's neuropsych testing or psych testing, a big question is usually the referral question. So this is a generalization, but if you're talking about like what a lot of folks will call a mental health diagnosis. So certainly like depression, anxiety, mood stuff, even ADHD, like a lot of folks will call that psychological testing.
Okay.
Neuropsych testing typically follows when there's a consideration of a medical diagnosis involved. So maybe it's epilepsy or cancer or brain injury, concussion, that kind of stuff.
Like TBI stuff?
TBI, yeah. So that's probably a short answer.
No, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you mentioned different CPT codes. Do you know off the top of your head what the CPT code would be for this is another curveball, sorry.
Hey, bring it on. Yeah.
The CPT code for the initial assessment testing and then the follow-up testing? They're different then?
I still bill a 90791 for the initial interview.
Okay.
Yeah. That can
would be
vary.
The same as a therapy code. Okay.
Yeah.
The initial interview where you're figuring out what they're coming in for, what sort of tests you would be administering, and then you would do the testing codes after that, and they come back for the actual testing.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Now, I should say too, I don't know how much detail y'all want around all the nuances, but if you are doing neuropsych testing in specific settings, sometimes they'll bill a 96116 for that initial interview and talking with other family members and collateral sources of info. So you can get, there are a lot of nuances to it, but I generally do a 90791 here in private practice.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the testing codes, like you said, they differ depending on what kind of testing we're doing and who's doing it. So that's another piece that I didn't even mention. So a lot of folks who do a lot of testing will have a supervising psychologist and then have testing be administered by a technician or a psychometrician. And that changes the CPT code as well.
Okay. Or how about, at least in Illinois, we have lots of students that are doing the psych testing for their practicum, their diagnostic practicum. That would be a different code then?
Yes, that's a little bit of a can of worms. I think, as far as I know, there's a little bit of a prohibition against students doing testing only for student learning. I should probably say that. But yeah, that's the general model. Like anyone who's not a licensed psychologist would bill under like a technician code. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a different CPT code. Interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. So do you have people that work in your practice that are kind of those technicians that administer them, or are all of your clinicians licensed psychologists?
Yeah, we do have technicians here in the practice. Yep.
Okay. So I guess I'm wondering what would be behind the decision of who actually administers the test then?
Yeah. So I think the driving factor is probably, well, there are probably a couple. I mean, one is that I think a psychologist's time can be better spent not administering the testing. If you have someone who is, really well trained, like a well-trained technician who really gets the ins and outs of administration and takes good notes and all of that, then that frees up the psychologist for, that could be, 8 to 10 hours per evaluation to be doing other things. So I think that's a big part of it, to be honest.
Other things like as in analyzing the results then?
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the model that we run here in our practice, where I do the interview. I do portions of the testing with each person. So I'm in there for probably, let's say 25% of the time in most cases. And then I also do all the interpretation and pulling the data together and writing the summary and the recommendations and the diagnosis and, and producing that final report. So yeah, I think a lot of folks run a tech model really to free up time to do interpretation. Yeah.
That reminds me of like when you go to the hospital to get an MRI, you have the MRI tech doing the actual test, but then you have the radiologist that is interpreting it and writing the report. So similar.
Right.
Yes, very similar.
Oh, makes sense.
I'm just curious because I did not realize they even had this. So what kind of experience do your techs have to administer the tests? Like what? I'm fascinated.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's an interesting question. So the folks that I hire, they are all advanced doctoral students. So they're a year or two away from their PhDs. They at least have master's degrees, and they've had at least a year or two of prior testing experience before they come in our practice. So that's kind of their level of training. And then, of course, we do, on-the-job training once they get here. But there's actually a big push. There's I forget the official name of it right now, but there's like a certification process for psychometricians that's gaining steam. And that's starting to become more important. Yeah, the Board of Certified Psychometrists. I just looked it up.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a push to get certified as a psychometrician, to make sure to maintain the quality of administration.
Okay.
Wow.
Neat. I had no idea.
I wonder if this varies by state. I wonder. I'm going to have to check it out.
Yeah, check it out.
That is fascinating. Okay. Wow.
What's the term? Psychometrician?
Psychometrician.
Yeah.
Psychometrician. Like that. Hi, what do you do? I'm a psychometrician.
I know, right?
Yeah, I know. I had no idea. I mean, this is just the mind-boggling piece is that there are, from our perspective as just clinicians doing the counseling part, it's like, how do you do all of the different pieces? And, that's where we said we really needed to get somebody to interview because it's just so many different components here with the actual administration and then the analysis and, kind of then the feedback. I mean, it would be really hard to be a one-stop shop and have to do all of that work alone. I mean, that would just be intense.
Yeah, it's taken a lot of time and a lot of years and a lot of trial and error and, phone calls with insurance companies to try to nail all of it down.
Right. Okay. Wow.
And I should say, too, I think this might be a good time to mention that I don't know if y'all do show notes or stuff like that. Yeah. So I have to refer to the current president of APA. His name is Tony Puente, and he has a ton of presentations and information out there about appropriate billing for psych and neuropsych testing.
Oh, great.
So if you can link to that,
absolutely.
Sure,
I know he has a website and some cool resources out there.
Okay. Yeah, we will definitely make sure we add that, because I think that's going to be a really, really helpful link for psychologists listening, and even, some other clinicians that are allowed in their state to do some of the testing. I think that would be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Complicated.
It is complicated. It's really, it's definitely more complicated. Yeah.
You're claiming that it's not, but I bet once you do it for a while, it's not so much, but this seems very complicated to me.
Right.
That's saying a lot, because it's usually billing in itself isn't complicated to me, but this whole different codes for different tests. So you mentioned writing reports and everything. Is that also covered by insurance?
Yes, it is. So that was one of those major shifts that I was talking about a few minutes ago, back in whatever it was, 2008, where, so report writing is now covered under the typical testing codes.
Okay.
Which helps a lot, because, between the history and the interpretation, probably at least 2 hours, maybe 3 or 4, depending on the eval. So that's a big chunk of time.
Sure.
Depending on the test and everything.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Are there specific tests that are not covered?
Yes. At least in my world, the ones that are typically not covered are academic tests. So the insurance companies, my understanding is that they sort of operate on the assumption that any academic testing is going to happen through the school district.
Which
is kind of a bummer. Schools do the best they can and, support students really well. And there are a lot of students who don't qualify for testing through the school who could still benefit from it. So that's tough. But those are the academic tests are the ones that are typically not covered. Okay.
So if you had someone who wanted to come and get services to get that academic testing, does your company still do them, but it would just be kind of a non-covered service?
Yeah. So there are a couple different ways that we do that. One is that I can not administer the entire academic battery. Like, there are different subtests that are maybe a little more relevant, for the presenting concern, without having to, do the whole battery. So we do that sometimes. But if someone is coming like specifically and they're only saying, hey, we have a question about a learning disorder, that is purely an academic concern. And if there are no other complicating factors, then I have to say, okay, well, here's the deal. Insurance doesn't typically cover testing for learning disorders. So that's an out-of-pocket expense.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then would you possibly refer them to their school?
Yeah.
If they would say, oh, I can't, afford that. Would you say, well, your school psychologist would probably do the same testing, or?
Yeah, that's tricky. So I was saying that a lot of kids don't typically qualify for testing through the school unless they're falling pretty clearly outside the average range, for either behavior concerns or disruptive behavior or academic concerns. At least here, and I think this is pretty consistent, they have to be at least clearly 2 grade levels behind to qualify for an evaluation. Yeah.
Yeah. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. That's unfortunate.
And I'm really cautious about telling parents what the school will or will not do.
Sure.
I'm always, I'll say you can request this and it might not happen. So.
Right. Sort of you can look into it. It's just, that's,
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah.
That does make it really challenging if, you're trying to make these assessments and trying to make sure that these kids are not kind of falling, down to the 2 grade levels behind. If you catch something sooner than later, you would just think that, preventatively that would make a big difference to provide appropriate accommodations if needed. That's definitely a huge challenge that your industry must face then in this respect.
Yeah, you're opening a big can of worms there. Services in the school. And
Yeah, that would be an interesting episode for your podcast, just because you deal with that side of things, kind of how you guys navigate that. That's really, I don't know, that sounds really challenging.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. I think that is my next interview. I'm talking with a school psychologist who's now in private practice to, kind of talk about bridging that gap. So,
wow. Okay. Neat.
It's a good shout. Yeah.
You mentioned doing multiple tests in one day. I guess you might have answered this earlier. How you handle the multiple tests is that you sort of don't necessarily do them all yourself. You pass them off to the, what's it called? Metro technician. No, I said it wrong. Not metro. I can't even get that term right. It's so new to my lexicon. How do you handle multiple tests in one day if you would be doing it themselves? Like, do you do a whole battery, and are all those tests in that battery billable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are different models and different practices, but we tend to try to knock out the whole battery in one day. So it ends up being probably 4 to 5 hours of actual testing. And then, we take breaks and a lunch break and all of that. So, we try to keep the person engaged as best we can, especially kiddos. But so all of that is billable. The limit that I've run into as far as insurance billing goes is that some insurance companies do limit you to billing no more than 8 hours of testing in a given day. So that's probably the main limitation, but that only happens with a couple that I work with.
Would that include your report writing?
Yes.
What if the testing takes 8 hours and you still have to do the report? You just have to bill it for another day?
The next day.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that makes sense. The insurance companies are saying you don't work more than 8 hours a day.
Yeah. So in a sense, they're doing us a favor, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Like, go home.
Thank you.
You do not need to write this report.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
And so the time that you spend on the report is pretty easily shifted around, depending on the date. Yeah.
Okay. So how are rejections handled then? Do you have to deal with rejections often?
At this point, I don't get a whole lot of rejections between just having done it for so many years. I kind of know the ins and outs and what insurance companies need, what information and what authorizations and how to write the authorizations. Probably the biggest rejections that we get are if the initial quote of benefits and coverage was wrong for whatever reason. Sure. And then, we have to go back and
that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of insurance companies are actually decent to work with. Like if we call and say, oh, well, we accidentally billed the wrong code, for this, can we just resubmit the claim? And usually that works fine.
Okay. So that's sort of similar to in the therapy world. If you call and you say, oh, I put in 90837 instead of this, they let you adjust.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I actually have another question that we didn't already provide, but I'm curious a little bit about what the kind of that follow-up session looks like when you're kind of providing the results for the testing. What is that kind of like for clients?
Yeah. So again, working with a lot of parents, I'll bring both of the parents in. If the kid is in high school, I'll have the kid come too. I think that's really important, for them to have some agency over their testing results and their positive qualities and, areas of concern. So the feedback session, typically I'll start and just go over things that went really well and really play up strengths for the client or the kiddo, talk about how those will serve them and come in handy, and then transition to things that were a little more challenging, which often gets at sort of the referral question and the diagnostic picture and how all that fits together. So then I present them with the diagnostic picture, and then that flows into a conversation about recommendations and what to do and what will be helpful and what kind of interventions would be appropriate. Yeah, just answer parents' questions as we go along and try to send them away with a really clear plan of how to move forward and why we're doing what we're doing.
Okay. And what types of things would you end up recommending in general?
Yeah. So it totally depends on the diagnostic picture and the kid and the parents and resources and that kind of thing. But I'd say, the main recommendations are, I refer a lot of kids for medication consults. That's a big one. So partnering with psychiatrists and, physicians around town. I talk a lot about how to bridge the gap to school and maybe pursue intervention in the academic setting. Talk about that. I do a lot of referrals to things like biofeedback or occupational therapy, individual counseling, of course, family counseling. So, yeah, those are the main recommendations. Social skills groups, that comes up a lot. Yeah.
Oh, sure. With the autism diagnosis and things like that. Yeah.
Right.
So are there any other tips or tricks that you have for psychologists listening regarding billing?
I think the biggest thing is just kind of having your ducks in a row as much as you can before you start doing testing and billing insurance. One, I mean, just to know it's totally doable. I've totally built a practice around it and we're successful. And, like I said, I keep deciding to take insurance, like we aren't going off. So totally doable. And there are some nuances to consider and just to make sure that you're doing everything, ethically and legally as far as your billing and have all those ducks in a row. I think that's important.
Yeah, that's really helpful. This was so informative. I did not realize how this all went down, and it sounds
no
like
idea.
You really know and figured out the best type of structure that works, and you're providing a wonderful service by kind of structuring it properly and being able to utilize your skills appropriately. So this is really, really fascinating.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah, it's fun to talk about, and I'm happy to spread the word. I love testing.
What I also like, too, is that you know when to outsource, too. With the technicians doing the testing and everything, I was thinking, oh, my goodness, how does he do all these tests and do all this billing and everything? But you've recognized your strengths and you're sort of the overseer and you're the radiologist, so to speak.
Yeah.
Sure. Hey, I'll take that comparison. Yeah.
Yeah. Because doing all the testing yourself would be exhausting and tedious. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, some psychologists really like to do their own testing, and I do some. I really like to be in there for some of the testing. And I kind of spent my time, I was a psychometrician when I was in grad school for a couple years, and I enjoy doing the interpretation and the recommendations a lot more at this point. So that's where
But you also, you're there for the initial assessment and things like that. So it's not like you're totally removed. Like you come in and the people don't know who you are, or they know who you are.
Right. Oh, of course. Yeah. And I still consider myself the point person and the main contact for their eval. Well, and that's actually, I'll throw this in there just because we're kind of talking about it. But if you are billing insurance under a psychometrician code, one of the mandates of that code is that the overseeing psychologist is checking in with the technician throughout the day to make sure that you can adjust the battery if you need to. And then they introduce the psychometrician, and then they also say goodbye to the client at the end of the day. So there are some guidelines for how to bill, under a psychometrician code that are probably important to be aware of.
That makes sense. So it's not really the psychometrician running their own show. It's like, okay, we're tag teaming this.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
Wow. This is really, really neat. I'm so glad that you were able to come on and answer our questions about, billing for psychologists. I mean, this is just one area where neither of us know anything. So, and you really helped do what we are so passionate about, which was kind of bust these myths about the difficulties with insurance as a provider. And, that I think is one of the biggest things is that, the language has been out there that scares people away. And so I really like that you are pro-insurance and kind of have that similar stance and kind of have demystified how intense it is for psychologists. So this is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come on and talk about all this stuff. I love spreading the word, like I said, and it's a fun thing. It's totally doable.
It seems like with any type of billing, really, trial and error, you learn all the kinks. And then once you know how to do it, the ship runs pretty smoothly.
Yeah, I think that's true. I totally agree.
Great.
So not to get discouraged by, the trial and error piece of insurance billing,
right?
Which I'm sure you've gone through.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I can't. Well, it's like we all say, if we had the money for the time spent on the phone with the insurance companies, it would just be But luckily, that's mostly the best.
Right. Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks again for listening to my reverse interview with Danielle and Katia on the Insurance Answers podcast. Hopefully you took away some helpful information there. If you are billing insurance, maybe there are a few things that you could tweak. If you're not billing insurance and want to, hopefully it gave you a little more clarity as to how to do that. Like I said, I think it's totally doable and has certainly been fairly easy here in our practice once you get those kind of standard operating procedures down. So, as always, thanks for listening. I'm having a great time doing these podcasts and getting to talk with folks and answer questions and connect with other people. This has just been an amazing experience so far. And I can't believe that this is already 20 episodes. I remember back before I started thinking, I just had no idea what this was going to turn into or end up like. And I have to say that it's just been a really cool journey so far. And I've had such a good time connecting with other folks and learning so much along the way. So I hope that you'll continue to tune in and be part of this community. If you do want to join the Facebook community, there's some great discussion there on testing, preferred measures, processes, billing, different things like that. You can search for our community at on Facebook at the bar at the top. Just search the Testing Psychologist community. You should be able to find us. And if you are interested in doing any consulting around building psychological assessment services in your practice, I would love to talk with you about that. We could do a complimentary 20-minute conversation just to kind of see where you're at, what you're wanting to do, and I'll give you some ideas about whether consulting could be helpful, and if not, where you might go instead. So hope to talk with you next week. We have lots of cool interviews coming up, and I'm excited. In the meantime, enjoy the summertime and take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.